30 minutes.
But you don't have to record, do you?
It becomes much easier to capture the voices of different people and characters than when you start working as a narrative researcher and interview. You'll also start to pick up more on little snippets of other conversations or even things you say that can spark ideas. And all of this will build in those layers and add depth and dimension and variety to your writing. So in broad terms, that's what narrative inquiry is. And in broad terms, that's how it can be useful to us as writers. So let's dive into a little bit more detail. I'm going to make some references to my research and to my books, and these have been by far the largest projects that I've done using this approach. So I want to give you just a little bit of background on that topic so that my examples make sense. So these are my two books on bachata, which is a guitar-based romantic music that was born in the urban shanty towns of the Dominican Republic in the early 1960s. Bachata really suffered a lot of discrimination in the early years because of those associations. But today it's one of the hottest genres on the global Latin market. Many Dominicans, both at home and those living abroad, have embraced bachata as synonymous with national identity. And that's when there's already an official national music in place. That's the merengue. But still, some Dominican fans and musicians who were part of bachata when bachata wasn't cool have not forgotten that hometown discrimination that plagued the genre for decades. And honestly, it still persists among certain groups. Many conversations I've had with Dominicans reveal visceral reactions when you talk about their music scene, and especially bachata. On both ends of the spectrum, you can hear everything from utmost scorn on one end to utter adoration on the other. Clearly, any music that has elicited these types of strong responses throughout its existence is something very powerful, and it does provoke some interesting stories. That's really what I was after when I set out to do my research, the stories of the musicians and of the genre of bachata itself. For my first book on bachata, which is the one that you see on the left, I was building on the little bit of research that was already out there. For the second, I focused on modern bachata, and that's a US interpretation of the Dominican Americans who were either born here or moved here at an early age. There was even less written about it. And so my book became a book of interviews of musicians, the ones who are creating this really interesting mix of different genres in addition to bachata with Spanglish. So let's talk about my method. The first step before you do any sort of narrative research is to read. Now, trust me, I like to meet people and I love to hear people's stories. So it is really tempting to dive in and just start interviewing. We're all storytellers. We want to hear those stories. But the truth is, you won't even know what questions to ask if you haven't done some good old-fashioned reading or other research on the topic. You need to get familiar with it to begin with. So before I started my field work on both of my books, I'd already done a lot of reading on bachata in general, Dominican history, current events, and so on. For my topic, of course, I also listened to a ton of music. All of that context is just as important as the story because stories happen within a specific context. And that context shaped the experiences and the events that my interviewees lived. So my research gave me that solid foundation, that solid understanding of the historical, social, and even musical landscape. That was very important to me so that I could understand references that these people made during their interviews. It also helped me formulate the questions I wanted to ask when I started my interviews. And I'll talk more about how to formulate those questions in just a second. Now, I believe 100% that it's just as important to do this type of prep work, even if you're going to use an interview to write a piece of fiction. For example, if I'm going to interview a doctor to make sure my medical terminology, a diagnosis, or a treatment is accurate in a short story, I can't just show up with a doctor and say, so concussions, go. For one, I would run the very real risk of not getting the information I actually wanted or needed. I could also end up being overwhelmed by having too much information that doesn't pertain, and I wouldn't know how to use that information. And I might really anger a medical professional if I showed up and wasn't very prepared. They might wonder why on earth they had taken time to talk with me if I didn't come across as professional myself. So the long and the short of it, prepare. That might be reading books. That might be reading online. You might end up in a library looking at microfiche. You might page through old newspapers you have yourself. You might study photographs or listen to music as I did. It might even be a visit to a museum. Whatever it takes to help you prepare for your topic. As part of that preparation, definitely take notes. That will help you formulate both the questions you want to ask and the order that it will make sense to ask those questions in. Now, maybe it goes without saying, but you definitely need to plan your questions. I've heard too many people say they've done an interview and then not know what to do with their information because they treated it just as an everyday conversation. An interview isn't a casual conversation where you just see where it takes you. Your interview will ultimately only be as good as the questions you ask. So the first rule of thumb is to ask open-ended questions. A really good way to make sure you're doing this is to start as many of your questions as you can with, tell me about. Tell me about is an invitation. It encourages your interviewee to tell you that story, to give you a narrative and not just a simple answer, and to really engage in this process of storytelling and story listening with you. You'll hear some amazing stories this way when you invite someone to tell you about their experiences or their knowledge, to share their stories with you. Also, try to introduce your questions so it doesn't feel like an interrogation. Let me share an example from my research. As I mentioned, bachata was really discriminated against in those early years. It's similar to the blues, if you think of it like that. So instead of asking a question like, why was bachata discriminated? It's kind of a harsh question. I could lead into it this way, and I did. Bachata knew a lot of discrimination in those early years. Tell me about why that was. It's a pretty simple polishing of the question, and it invites, again, that story. Other lead-ins might be more involved. Just remember, it's a conversation, not a third degree. Just this morning, I was listening to an interview, an online interview with a modern bachata artist, and I found it interesting that the interviewer used "tell me about," but that person did too much of a lead-in. I think they talked about 5 minutes, and then the musician started to talk, and then they interrupted him. The lead-in included things like, I know that. I would not do that. Even if you do know some information, you're mining this person who has the experience and mining their experiences to hear their story. So keep it open-ended. If you say you know something, they won't tell you. And one, you might be wrong. And two, you won't get the richness of their experiences. So lead in, but don't give too much so that your answers do continue to be open and in narrative form from your interviewees. Now, when you go to your interview, take a notebook, but it's not to write down your interviewee's answers to your questions. And I'll talk more about that in just a second. You have your notebook with you to jot down follow-up questions. It's really easy to get caught up, at least it is for me, to get caught up in the story that you're listening to. And then you can forget a question that pops into your mind while the other person's talking, because you don't want to really interrupt with it unless it's a quick clarification. Trust me, they're going to give you that narrative answer when you ask me those tell me about type questions. You don't want to interrupt that flow. So jot down your follow-up questions and then ask them. Now, why on earth would I say that your notebook isn't there to write down your interviewee's answers? My answer is it's just too risky. We can't write as fast as people talk. One of my numerous hats I wear is that I'm a certified court interpreter. And we are told when we're training for this profession that people speak, at least in court, over 200 words a minute. It's difficult to interpret simultaneously speaking. It's impossible to write that down. You won't be able to write it down while you're listening. You could miss something while you're furiously trying to write that fast if you're trying to write to keep up. And worse yet, you might misquote someone. So instead of writing down your interviewee's answers to your questions, I really recommend you record your interviews. The beauty of our little looker upper of our smartphone is that you can easily record your conversations and then move the files to the cloud or another device where you can more easily play them back. I recorded all of my interviews so that I could engage in the interview, so I wouldn't miss anything, and so that I could accurately quote my sources. Then I did the time-consuming part, the transcription. I transcribed each interview. When you first start transcription, you'll find it is time-consuming. It does take time. And trust me, it is tempting to want to skip it. It's painful at first. But the more you're working with someone and you get used to the cadence of their speech, you know when to hit pause where they pause. You're going to feel it in advance. Transcription is essential. It's a cornerstone, I would say, of the interview process. It helps keep you accurate, but it can also give you ideas. Sometimes you don't always know exactly what's important, and you discover that in your transcription of the interview. So for example, in my first book on bachata, the interviews supplemented more traditional research as I told the genre's history, and as I looked for ties to Dominican identity. I was working across multiple interviews and then multiple sources. So I printed the transcripts of all of my interviews to try to find those big patterns among them. This meant I read them and I reread them several times. I then color coded the quotes that I wanted to use with colored pens and grouped them by topic. So then I could go back and cut and paste and print off documents that had all of the quotes I wanted to use per topic. My second book was a collection of 27 interviews. So each chapter was a musician or a band giving their own story. And I had an introduction and a conclusion where I was doing the same thing of drawing out those common themes. So I followed this similar process of recording all my interviews and transcribing them. But this project also included what's known as restorying. Restorying is a process by which you provide the context, the organization, you shape the story, you give it an overarching framework, and you'll make links among ideas as appropriate. In my case, this often meant moving chunks around to put them in chronological order, or maybe clarifying a reference to another artist or a song. Restoring is probably what you would do if you were working on a memoir, for example. So I want to share an example from my book. I interviewed Chichi Cava, and he is the lead guitarist for one of the most popular Latin artists on the music scene. In all my interviews, I would start out just to get some general information. I asked them to give me their name, their artistic name, their stage name, their date and place of birth, and that type of question. And then would follow with some kind of open questions to help set my interviewees at ease, to kind of establish that pattern of me asking them to tell me about something and then just letting them go. When I asked Chi to tell me about how he got into music, he gave me this great narrative about how he first started listening to music and when he first began to listen to bachata. Then I invited him to tell me about how he'd gotten into playing bachata. And Chi told me this amazingly fun story about how he learned to play on a toy guitar that was missing a string. He said he'd go into the bathroom in the library where he worked in New York and practice on his breaks. I thought that was a pretty cool story, but it didn't lead the interview. It came more in the middle. I needed to build up the rapport for him to share that. At the end of the interview, he thought back on that story and he said, I play requinto for Romeo Santos. I learned to play my first songs on a toy guitar my father bought me. And now I'm playing with the #1 Latin artist all over the world. The minute I heard that, I knew that was the opening for his chapter. I let that story about the toy guitar run as a thread throughout. And when I let Chi read his chapter to give it his final approval, he loved that I had drawn that out. It was important to him. That's restoring in essence, the beauty of finding that unifying thread. If you're interviewing someone to write a piece of fiction, I still recommend recording the interview and transcribing it. This will help you make sure that you have any information down correctly that you need, like in my example about talking to a doctor about concussions. It can also help you capture that unique voice. Even if you don't plan on copying what that person said directly into your piece of fiction, this whole process of transcribing an interview tunes you into each person's unique way of speaking. And of course, as we know, mastering dialogue, mastering voice is an important step to writing really good and convincing fiction. And just one more important consideration before I share some examples. Know what you need to do to use the content of your interviewers. The publisher of my books on bachata required me to have a signed document for interviewees. Now, that would vary by publisher. That would vary depending on what you intended to do with the information you get from your interviews. But if you think there's any chance that you might look for a more traditional publishing route, it's just a good idea to go ahead and ask your interviewees to sign a document while you're with them or while you're in immediate communication with them. This can be done digitally too, so keep that in mind. Now I'd like to share an example of the type of answers I was able to get from the artists that I interviewed for my studies using this tell me about type approach. Quite a few of these were in Spanish, so I went ahead and just translated them for our purposes. This is the question I'm going to use as an example. One of the most interesting questions that I did ask was about the underlying tone of bachata, and it's often described as amargue. As I mentioned, bachata was born in the 1960s. It descends from bolero, which was the most popular romantic music in Latin America in the decades preceding bachata's birth. Bachata inherited quite a few different elements from the bolero, in addition to being a romantic music. It was performed in smaller groups or trios. There was always this dialogue between the singer and an unidentified second person. And the guitar was always super important to both bolero and bachata. Now, in spite of these similarities, bachata is most different from bolero in its underlying sentiment. Bolero is primarily nostalgic, but bachata is melancholic. There's no doubt about it. Bachata speaks of love and suffering in every facet. It's a product of marginality, just like the blues. And the lyrics often reflected disillusionment. They reflected the realities of loneliness, of having to go without things you needed. The lyrics were very emotional, and they were sung in a plaintive voice that when you listen to it, often appears to be truly weeping. Clearly, there was a lot of despair in that underlying tone. And this contributed to the common description of bachata's tone as cortavenas. That's meaning something that's extremely depressing or something that makes you want to slit your wrist. In fact, the Dominicans have this little gesture. If you don't even have to say it, cortavenas, it's really depressing. It makes you want to slit your wrist. So that's how bachata was described. And today even, many still refer to bachata as música de amargue, or songs of bitterness, because of that underlying feeling. Now, if you get out your trusty Spanish-English dictionary, you won't find amargue in it. It's not the standard translation for bitterness. If you get out your Dominican Spanish dictionary, it's in there, however. So I thought this word and this whole idea of an underlying sentiment that uses a non-standard word to describe it was very interesting, and I wanted to know what more about it. So the question I asked went like this. People always talk about bachata's feeling being one of amargue. Tell me about what amargue is. And these are some of the answers I got. Lenny Santos said, it's a love story. You're depressed, and it has to do with a girl leaving you, or it has to do with infidelity. That's basically it. You're crying out your heart. And it has to do with the lyrics of the song. It has to do with the guitar and the instrumentation. Henry Santos said, as an artist, I just feel it. Amargue is a combination of real sorry feelings. The blues, it's total blues, it's Dominican blues, and a really sad guitar. Joey Vera said, every song has some amargue, that moment of sadness in the case of a lost love, or that moment of happiness if it's a love you hope to have. Davidcito Paredes told me this really colorful story to highlight what amargue means. He said, they were interpretations of things you wanted to say, maybe to a woman. You grew bittered and cried, and it was like a song. I know people who embrace the jukebox. Listening to a song, they embrace the jukebox because they thought they were embracing a woman or that they were talking to her. The way I see it, that's amargue, the feelings in the song. I always love that story. It always makes me laugh. And I recorded Davidcito with my video camera back in the day, 10 years ago. And I love to watch it because he's mimicking even the embracing of the jukebox. I don't think I would have gotten such rich answers if I'd assumed I knew what amargue was, or if I just said, define amargue. Instead, I asked every artist I interviewed to tell me about it. Now, once that even got me a demonstration. When I asked Gerson Corniel my amargue question, he insisted he couldn't tell me about what it was, but that he could demonstrate. And he reached over and grabbed his guitar and played a bit of the same song, once with and once without amargue. The sound of his voice, his face was contorted in pain. He had tears in the corners of his eyes. That was amargue. And I don't think I'd have gotten that if I'd asked for a definition. So these are just a few of the comments that I got in my interviews about this particular topic. But from them, you can get a pretty good idea of what that feeling of amargue is. And also how important the guitar is to expressing amargue in bachata. And all of this description is thanks to an open-ended question that invited a conversation. Now, I have used this approach and this same technique for a variety of different projects. Again, I like to hear people's stories, so if in doubt, I try to find a way to use narrative inquiry. Some of these projects have been academic and some have been creative, but the approach has served me well every time. So I'm going to share a few more examples. Recently, a Dominican family asked me to interview their parents and write their life histories. Now, I'd never met these people, but before I did, I asked when they were born and where they were born in the Dominican Republic and when they immigrated to New York. That really helped me know what was going on in both locations at the time they were there. It gave me that context. I didn't know them, as I said. I flew to Miami, where they now live, in 2019 to interview them. And I set the interview up as a conversation. I did this tell me about type questions about different aspects of their lives. And I got each one of them individually to speak for 3 hours straight on the first day. And then we did a joint interview with them for another 3 hours the second day. They didn't know me, but we just started talking. And it was a fantastic experience. One of the interesting questions that I asked them was, you've lived several different places in your lifetime. Tell me about where you've been happiest. That was such an amazing question. They talked for the longest time on it. What I found interesting was that it was different. The answer was different for each, but for each, it was also one of the homes that they felt symbolized all the reasons they'd immigrated to the US in the first place. It was pretty powerful stuff. As a professor, I've used narrative inquiry to do educational action research. And this is a type of qualitative research. And the main goal or aim of it is to improve your practice as an educator. I've used interviews as one of my data collection methods for several projects. In one, I interviewed learners at the conclusion of a class on the Latin American telenovela or soap opera. I wanted to find out what their experiences were because the class was very different. Not only did they learn about Latin American telenovelas or soap operas, they had to work cooperatively to write, film, and produce a shortened version of one. Now, I got a lot of really good information about learners' perceptions of their learning and use of Spanish. I did individual, group, and class interviews. But as is often the case with narrative research, there were a lot of things that surprised me. I was expecting I'd hear that they had to use Spanish a lot more than other in more traditional classes. I was suspecting they'd say, oh, I learned how to use iMovie and film and edit. It was great. And I did. It was the comments about gaining a better understanding of their peers and thinking empathetically about others that surprised me. For example, one student said, the truth is, telenovelas really present a good example of the problems that affect all of us. And neither our social class nor race matter, but love and life are always complicated. And the beautiful thing is to live them. That, as a teacher, brought tears to my eyes. And again, that's the type of statement I got by having a conversation and asking learners to tell me about their experiences. That statement and many others guided my redesign of the course when I taught it again. I knew I had the language proficiency outcomes in place. I'd met those. Now I could really mine the soft skill approach. With regards to fiction, I have to credit my grandfather as my first interviewee. My earliest memories of my grandfather are of him telling me stories about his life. He had a dairy near Florence, Kansas, so only about an hour from you there in Wichita, and he delivered milk all over the community. He was also part of a men's quartet from the time he was in high school, and he would travel all over Kansas to sing. Those two things alone gave him a lot of stories to tell, and I loved to listen to him. I'd often ask him to repeat some of those stories that I started to know by heart. And I would say, Grandpa, tell me about the time. You see the pattern? I've been doing this for quite a while. Those stories really became ingrained in me, and I've fictionalized several of them or different aspects or pieces of them for my own writing across the years. And of course, I credit my grandfather, that talented storyteller, a natural storyteller, with giving me an ear for stories and for voice. Now, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't also say that I think narrative inquiry is useful for poets too. More than once, a simple statement that I've heard someone make has struck a chord with me and become the basis for a poem. Again, we start to attune our ears to different voices, and we begin to catch different rhythms and even images that can enrich our poetry. For example, this past April, a friend of mine who lives in London and we decided to write a poem every day during April for National Poetry Month, and we would share them over WhatsApp. One day he messaged me with his poem and he asked me what I was up to. And I told him that the neighbor up the street had caught me smelling his lilacs. I love lilacs, and told me to pick a bouquet. My neighbor up the street is retired and an excellent gardener. I am neither. And so when he said I could pick some of his lilacs and make a bouquet, I was really excited. So I did, but I wanted to show him my gratitude. So I was busy baking cookies when my friend messaged me. And I told him what I was doing. And this friend prefers to send voice messages rather than actually text. So all of a sudden, bing, here came his answer. And he said, so your kitchen smells of lilacs and cookies. That line just struck me, and I massaged it a little, and it became the heart of a narrative poem. So all of this takes me back to where we started. People make sense of their experiences by telling stories. And as writers, we can use open-ended questions to find out about those stories for a variety of purposes. Now, I'm going to be quiet, and we're going to do some activities in a minute, but I always like to say I'm the guide as a teacher, professor, speaker, and let my students in my classes and you, my fellow writers, do your thing. So we'll be writing in a minute. But before we jump into the activities, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have so far.
Do you have any audio clips of the music?
The bachata, I have, well, it's the beauty of the internet. You can always find things, but yes. And while we're doing some activities, I would be happy to put on some background music. And I have some from concerts that I've gone to. And I actually, as part of this, I became very good friends with a producer who's now located in Miami. He was born in the Dominican Republic, raised in New York, lives in Miami. And he did an album 3 years ago now called Bachata Rising. And it was up and coming young bachata artists. And he asked me to write an introduction for it. And I typed it up and sent it off. And he said, and I messaged him, said, you're going to have this. And he said, no, I'm not. There's a hurricane. So I did a voice memo and just read the intro for him. He asked me to record it. So it was too short to be on iTunes, but on the few discs that he pressed, I'm the intro. I feel pretty proud of that because I can't sing. But yes, when we're doing some of our activities, I'd be glad to put some bachata on in the background so you could hear it.
That'd be great.
You have other questions? Nancy.
Run into a situation, have you ever run into a situation where you ask, kind of tell me about this or whatever, and you get next to nothing?
Yes. So I did as a PhD student, I took some qualitative research courses, and then I have taken some training to do what's called an oral proficiency interview to measure learners' proficiency. And that right there trained me as well as anything, because when you're trying to get a sample out of somebody who's only had a semester of Spanish, it is so painful sometimes. And I always say you have this smile frozen on your face trying to, yes, it has happened to me. And I think one of the things, the first time it happened, I was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? But I like stories. And so I just would think of another way to either ask the question, or I would go away and ask a different question where I thought I might get a little bit more and come back. Or you can always say, that's really interesting. Could you tell me more, or tell me more about, and pick up the one thread of it. If you are nervous about that kind of thing, before you do it, and Nancy, I know, has a lot of experience writing memoirs. Anybody who feels nervous, I would say practice, and we're going to practice with a friend and ask them to purposefully do that. Ask them to not give you much information, and then work at pulling it out. Have them be the difficult interviewee, and that can be incredibly helpful.
Julie, I'd like to just add something to that. I have two daughters who are introverts, and I've learned from my daughters that sometimes when I'm asking them questions, they don't have the time to process an answer. And as introverts, they need to process before they speak. So sometimes I think giving a person a chance to think about it and then coming back and saying, let's take a break or something, and, you know, or can we, maybe we'll bring this up at the end of the conversation. And then even in that, but in that time, it may have processed.
Yep, that's absolutely true. And this is something I tell my college students, that research shows that adult learners often need 30 seconds to come up with an answer. And I say, just get used to it. Silence is a good thing. We'll just wait. Nobody needs to feel rushed. Nobody needs to feel awkward. In an interview setting, you could say, oh, take your time. And if they say, oh, I'd like to come back to it, okay. Again, you kind of have your structure in the order you want to ask the questions, but it's flexible, and you can pick up on the ebb and flow of these interviews and on how your interviewees are responding.
Got a question. Julie, do you ever give the person you're interviewed the questions ahead of time, or topics that you might talk about, so they can kind of think about it?
If they request it, yes. I had one guy who, it was amazing. He was as verbose writing as he was speaking, which kind of surprised me. He said, would you mind giving me the questions beforehand? And I did. It was amazing. He answered, and I think he actually just wanted topics, but it's almost as if he could read my mind. He answered questions that I hadn't asked yet. And so that even gave me some more ideas than for the interview when I did interview him. And that was a phone interview at that time. So yeah, I think it depends on what you're looking for. Sometimes if people have the specific questions, they will almost feel obligated to really prepare. And the spontaneity of it can be interesting and get you some really interesting topics. But if they feel more comfortable, then you could certainly give those to them.
Have you interviewed your own family, your parents?
Yes, I actually did. Let's see, I did 70th birthday videos for both of my parents. Because I do, like I said, I did that telenovela class. I also like to tinker with video. So I did these videos, and then I have the recordings from when I was, I would say, probably a junior or senior in high school. So a while ago, I recorded my grandfather. It was a cassette tape. I do not have video. We did not have that. I couldn't do it digitally back then either, but I've since had it digitized. So I do have those, and I'm so grateful that I do. Are there any other questions? You can always think about them. I'll give you time at the end too, but I definitely want to give you some time to do some writing. And so this is our first activity, and it has kind of two parts. So first of all, think of two topics, one that you might use for fiction, or you could do poetry. You can intermingle how you want to do it. One for something more nonfiction, where you might use this narrative inquiry approach. So just think of the two topics and jot them down. See if you can think of the name of someone you could interview, and come up with two tell me about type questions. Okay. So meanwhile, I am going to play background background music and I'll look for bachata. Okay, shall we share a few topics and the types of questions that you came up with? Any willing volunteers?
I have one.
Okay,
We had a friend, Karl Karasik, who escaped communist Czechoslovakia and came to the US. When I met him, he knew like 3 English words, but he was living close to where my kids went to school. And so we taught him English with sign language, you know, this pencil, notebook. So I asked him, tell me how you escaped or how you came out of Czechoslovakia. And so he told us that he hiked over the mountains. Well, how did you manage to live? How did you eat? You know, he called them Christian hermits in the mountains of Austria that taught him how to eat, how to cook parched grain and, you know, cheese, things he could buy along the way. And then one day I said, because he told us so many things, like we went to a church where they had huge numbers of kids. And we took him to a Halloween party. And he just was flabbergasted. And he said, in Czechoslovakia, the children don't smile like this. And the only word for party that he knew was Communist Party. And so one day I said, Carl, why did you decide to come to America? And he said, well, he said, I wanted to go to New Zealand, but my mother told me there were headhunters there. And I thought about Canada, but it's too cold. So that's why he decided. Oh, and he said, besides, in Czechoslovakia, everybody sees how bad everything is, and they have to say how good it is. And he said, I figured if they were lying about Czechoslovakia, they were probably lying about America too. So,
Wow. That would definitely be an interesting interview. And like you say, the stories, I think one would lead to another.
right.
Very interesting.
We knew him for about 9 months, and it was really interesting.
Wow. Do you have other volunteers?
I'll volunteer.
Okay.
I am writing historical fiction in the 1800s, of course, and I need to understand what it was like to be on a wagon train. And so in the homesteading in Kansas, I have some friends that used to do the reenactment wagon trains. And I thought I would ask them, and Ken Spurgeon, who is quite active in history in the area, I thought I could ask him. Tell me how you became interested in doing the reenactments of the wagon trains, and tell me what you have learned about traveling on a wagon train that surprised you, something that you enjoyed, or something that you hated. So I think I'd get information about wagon trains from that.
Yeah, and I like that variety of dividing the experience into these different aspects, because sometimes when we interview people, they think that we only want the rosy side of things and the pretty side of things. And if you want that whole picture, you need, like you said, something that surprised you, something you hated, you need the whole picture. So very interesting. Any other volunteers?
What you just said about wanting something nice, to hear something nice. One of the topics I thought would be neat, go into a prison and ask the prisoner, tell me about your victim.
Okay, I heard part of it. Could you repeat it, or have somebody up near the mic repeat it so I could hear all of it?
Tell me about your victim.
Ah, that would definitely be interesting.
And then another thing, you gave me a delicious idea. My father wrote a memoir book once that it asked him specific questions, and he wrote down the answers. I have it, and I'm going to go in and see what those were. Like I'm doing an interview, I can look at those questions that he wrote down, those answers that he wrote down, and make a beautiful story out of that.
Oh, that's a great idea. Wonderful. Like I say, my grandfather, I go back and listen to the interviews I did with him years ago. And sometimes it's just a phrase or a word that sparks my imagination.
I like what Gloria said, because I have several memoirs of a couple of aunts, and I have my dad's I have 14 pages of my dad's shipboard diary when he was in the Navy in the South Pacific in World War II.
Wow.
And it would be fun to go in and ask the questions and see what I could find.
Yeah, because they're not here to be able to ask them,
Yeah,
so we just go with what we can.
right, yeah.
Even with writing fiction, if you think this is what I would ask them, and you know enough based on either the diary that you have, or you remember enough from them to intuit how they might respond, even that sort of internal interview with the person can really work well for fiction. I say we should practice some. So that's going to be the next activity. So we're going to work in pairs or groups, however you want. And I'm trying to see if I have the ability to put you in breakout rooms online. The idea is that you're going to select a topic. I've given you some ideas, or you can pick one of your own choosing, and you'll work in pairs. You'll tell your partner that you're working with the topic you chose so that it's not uncomfortable for anyone. And then once they know what topic you want to be interviewed on, they'll take around 5 minutes and they'll come up with just a few tell me about questions, and you'll do the same with their topic. Then when you're ready, or at the conclusion of around 5 minutes, you can begin interviewing just to do the practice. I have dug out the video of one of the bachata songs. And so since we had a request for some bachata music, it's about 4 minutes. I'll play it and then, kind of watch the clock, give you another minute or so. It might take more than 5, but we'll just roll with it. Does anybody have any questions before we dive in? Okay, I'm going to hit stop share and see if that allows me to put the people online in breakout rooms. Right now, I don't see that I can. Yeah, I don't think I can. So folks in breakout rooms, or not breakout rooms, online, I think we're going to have to go it alone. You may have to imagine your topic as if you were going to interview somebody else and write questions for that person.
We're going to need you to share your screen again so we see the topics.
Sure thing. Here comes the screen. I put as suggestions: a scar, your first car, your first kiss. This one would be fun. The first thing I ever wrote or published. The funniest or most embarrassing thing that ever happened to me. Graduation. Or any other topic you would prefer.
So you want me to ask you about
Julie, are we
Yes.
supposed to ask our partner what they want to talk about?
Yes, so everybody feels comfortable, because you might ask somebody, speaking from experience, you might ask somebody in a situation like this, oh, tell me about your first car, and they had a terrible accident in it and they don't want to talk about it. So let them pick the topic just so everybody feels comfortable.
Thinking about the way you was, me hace tanta falta the way you were. Tus besos, tus caricias, ¿dónde estarán? ¿Dónde estarán? The way it was, me hace tanta falta the way you were. Tus besos, tus caricias, ¿dónde estarán? ¿Dónde estarán? No entiendo nada, aunque tú estés aquí, te noto alejada. Dime qué pasa aquí, no entiendo nada. No entiendo nada. Cuánto cambiaste, el fuego apagaste. De tus amigas al final te llevaste. Toda esa envidia en ti la sembraste. Y en Instagram borracho te desahogaste. Dime, bebé, ¿por qué no resolvemos aquí ya de una vez? Entiende que yo estoy pa' ti, sabes muy bien. Me duele no tenerte aquí. Aunque estés aquí, me paso preguntando si yo te quiero y tú me quieres tanto. ¿Por qué diablos que vivimos peleando? Siento que tu energía se va alejando. Me la paso preguntando si yo te quiero y tú me quieres tanto. ¿Por qué diablos que vivimos peleando? Siento que tu energía se va alejando. No entiendo nada, aunque tú estés aquí, te noto alejada. Dime qué pasa aquí, no entiendo nada. No entiendo nada, me la paso preguntando si yo te quiero y tú me quieres tanto. ¿Por qué diablos que vivimos peleando? Siento que tu energía se va alejando. Me la paso preguntando si yo te quiero y tú me quieres tanto. ¿Por qué diablos que vivimos peleando? Siento que tu energía se va alejando.
You didn't have any phone. How to fix it.
Didn't know it was. I have to guess.
Yeah, so now
Okay, it looks like we've gotten a really good start on some interviewing. Let's talk about some of the things that you learned or some of the things that you found challenging. So tell me about how the interview process went.
We didn't finish, did you?
Well, I'd be happy to give you some more time. It's hard for me to gauge. You know, if I were in person, I'd be wandering around, I'd be commenting. I don't stand still when I teach. So, okay, you want to keep talking? Sounds good.
Yeah.
I'll hit play on the background music.
Well, I think he finally said. Yeah. I did not get it. I can't think of anything else that's exciting to me, but it's pretty exciting. I think the only that was sort of a special conversation. You want somebody to say, yeah. How much work is that in my mind? So Nathan,
¿Qué será de mí con tantas penas en mi pobre vida? ¿Qué será de mí?
Okay, so now we've had a little bit more time of practicing our interviews. And I know it's a little bit harder for the people who are online since we couldn't put them in breakout rooms. So I want to be respectful of them. Let's share some ideas. What did you find easy? What did you find challenging? What was something interesting that came up out of your interviews? Tell me about your experience.
Well, I've met a couple of people who I want their stories.
And that is something that often happens.
Luckily, Sandy and I both are in historical fiction, and so this is where our discussion kept going back and forth.
I just enjoyed learning more about Dixie here, about her first car.
That's always a fun one.
And she started driving at age 14. Yeah. To go to
So
school
did I.
on country roads in a 1939 Chevy coupe with stick shift and with no professional driver's lessons. Her mother taught her. I guess this is common.
I got mine at 14.
Yeah.
So I got to drive at 14. No, I didn't.
Really? You? No, I didn't have professional teacher driving.
Well, we had it in high school.
Oh, no, it was just after our generation.
See, I really enjoy, people say I ask too many questions and especially my kids and grandkids. And my husband too. But I am fascinated by people's stories. And I can
Yes.
go on and on about that.
Yes. And if Dixie, if you have a picture of that car,
Yeah.
this sounds like it could be a very interesting story to pursue.
I don't think I have a picture of it.
Oh my God.
Well, you'll have to paint the picture then for your interviewer.
Yes, yes.
Go online and find it.
Yeah. I'll get our little looker uppers out.
She asked me what color it was, and I told her it was black and tan, like my dad's black and tan coonhounds. It was black because it was intended to be black, but it was tan where it was all rusted out.
I think I've driven a few like that. Yep. That's good.
Euphemism for.
Who else?
Anybody else want to share something from the process?
Hooray.
Well, he told me about,
Uh-oh.
his psychic dog, and told him to marry this chick.
They probably.
I don't know that, yeah, I don't know that we did the assignment really. It's just chatting.
Well, you know, when you sit down to talk to someone, there's always going to be a story.
So does it matter if the story's real or not?
That depends on what you're writing.
It's also interesting to, or important to realize how important listening is. And, you know, I've met some people in my life who ask me a question and I get 5 words into the answer and they ask another question. And so listening completely, I think is really difficult in our.
Yeah, I think you make a very good point.
Because we're used to looking at a screen like you are now.
Exactly.
And, you know, we don't have the patience. We've got a 3-minute attention span.
Yeah.
Especially the younger kids.
Yes,
Do they know how to carry on a conversation?
they do, I would say.
High school.
On their phone.
Well, that's it.
I find as an introvert that sometimes when an extrovert asks me a question, I don't respond fast enough.
Right.
And I'll kind of start and I'll try to think while I'm talking, and sometimes certain people will jump in and finish the sentence for me. And at least 90% of the time no, that's not where I was going with that. But then it's a distraction. So then I have to kind of recalibrate and start over again. So,
Like they're helping you too much.
yeah,
Yeah.
they're trying to help me.
I'm also an introvert, but I also have a speech impediment. So if I delay my answer, trying to put it together in my brain before I answer it, the tendency for the other person is to interrupt or answer it for me. Or somebody else in the conversation answers it for me, whether, you know, it might not be an interview or a 2-person situation. So that really pisses me off.
Yeah, and these are common things that I don't know that we always think about, because we're in our own little world, we're in our own head, in our own world in our head, and we're positive everybody thinks just like we do, and that people are going to respond just like we do. And so really, if you don't know the person well, you're really going to want to ask some introductory type questions to figure out, are they someone who dives in and gives you this big long narrative right off? Are they someone who's going to ponder the question a little bit more and adapt to them? And if you think, I'm not comfortable with silence, maybe you just say from the beginning, I really want to make sure that you're able to think about these things, that I'm able to think of follow-up questions. So just, you know, if I'll give you time, I'll give me time to think, enjoy the silence. And this, again, this is something I do with students, because I put them one-on-one with me at the end of the semester, make them talk in Spanish. And so they need to get used to being able to have time and feel confident taking the time to formulate questions. And I always just, I mean, it's good for me too, to think of what's going to come next and what I want to say in response to what they tell me. And so I say, just let's embrace the silences and the spaces for both of us. Fine to say that.
Embrace the silences. I like that. That's a title for a poem.
There, I've had my one brainstorm for the day. Well, I want to be respectful of your time as a group. So I'm going to share my screen again real quick. I have a bonus. This is a bonus. Gretchen mentioned my book, Can Be Verse, and so I wanted to share one of the poems. And I had somebody ask me just yesterday, what's your favorite one? I couldn't pick a favorite one, because each of these represents and means something to me of my lifelong, since I was 14, almost my whole life, relationship with Anne of Green Gables and with reading. But what I've heard from friends around the world who've read the book, they really like the first poem. It's entitled Kindred Spirits. So here's a quick reading from my book. You are there, though I have never met you, heart beating in time to mine. We meet along the red dirt roads in Lover's Lane, among the blossoms of Violet Vale, and share a prickly thrill in the shadows of the haunted wood. We dream of a bosom friend, puffed sleeves, winning the Avery, a Matthew's faith in us, and a Gilbert's devotion. Anne dreamed us all into being, this community of like-minded souls. And you are there, waiting to be discovered, around the bend in the road, across the miles and years, with the turning of the page. That is the conclusion of my talk for today. I'd be happy to answer more questions. You also have my author email there. I have a web page, and you can connect with me on Facebook if you're interested as well. Again, if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask.
Would you read another couple of poems?
I most certainly would. So anybody who knows me well knows I like windows. I have one behind me, and I love to sit in this chair by the window. Sometimes I sit there and write, sometimes I sit there and read, sometimes I just sit there with the dog, because that's good therapy for any writer. So this is entitled Windows, and it's a golden shovel poem. Ellen Montgomery also wrote poetry. She loved poetry. She knew she couldn't make a living at it. So the line that I took was from her poem, The Little Gable Window, and that line is, by the little gable window of that cottage far away. And my golden shovel poem, Windows, reads as so. Like an old friend, these pages turn and take me by the hand, away to Prince Edward Island and the distant space where I yet dream a little. Maud's signal beckons from Anne's east gable, calling through the years with her light in the window. It blinks across the time and space in flashes of kindred code, a magnet, a beacon that reaches this dreamer at a window in a Kansas cottage, scribbling her own shimmery verses, sending them far, droplets of light like dandelion seeds borne away. And for a little variety, this is a prose poem on Cavendish Beach. Cavendish was Ellen Montgomery's home, and it is the village that she modeled Avonlea on. The song of the sea is salty in its mournful ebb and flow. The haunting call of gulls on the wind lulls me as I wander barefoot below. And on the dunes, the dry grass rings like chimes upon the breeze. The air is laced with sweet perfume from a nearby wild rose. White waters crash upon the crags and trip along the coast. And I ramble through the somnolent scene, searching, seeking, scouring the shore for a glimpse of the immortal Anne. The waves embrace the paths we write across the years and sands. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you from District 4 and District 6
Yeah.
for joining us. Great to have you.
We'll see y'all later.
Ah.